power trips often end in the most humiliating freefalls. When two arrogant patrol officers spotted a black man driving a luxury car through their wealthy, quiet suburb, they saw an easy target. They saw a quota. They saw someone they could intimidate, humiliate, and break down just to stroke their own fragile egos. What they didn't see was the United States Army colonel who had survived 3 combat deployments, commanded thousands of troops, and possessed a Rolodex that reached the highest echelons of the Pentagon. They thought they were the apex predators of the asphalt. But by the time the night was over, their precinct would be swarmed, their careers would be burning to the ground, and their chief would be staring down a career-ending nightmare he never saw coming. The rain came down in relentless, rhythmic sheets, turning the asphalt of Route 1 into a slick black mirror. It was just past 11,000 p.m. on a Friday. Inside the cabin of his brand-new midnight blue Lexus LS 500, the world was quiet, insulated from the storm by acoustic glass and premium leather. Colonel David Henderson of the United States Army let out a long, heavy exhale, the kind of breath that carried the weight of a grueling 80-hour week at the Pentagon. At 52 years old, David was a man carved from discipline. His posture was impeccably straight, even when exhausted. His hair was cropped close to his scalp, graying neatly at the temples, contrasting with his deep, unblemished skin. He was currently in civilian clothes, a crisp white button-down shirt, a charcoal cashmere sweater, and tailored slacks. He had just finished a high-stakes logistics briefing regarding the redeployment of assets from Eastern Europe, and all he wanted was to reach his home in the quiet, upscale enclave of Oak Creek, Virginia, pour a glass of 18-year-old Macallan, and sleep. Oak Creek was an affluent suburb, the kind of place where manicured lawns were practically mandated by law, and the neighborhood watch was aggressively observant. David had bought his home there 6 months ago, seeking a quiet retreat. As he turned off the main highway and onto the winding, tree-lined streets of Oak Creek, he noticed a pair of headlights pull out from a darkened side street, falling in right behind him. David checked his rearview mirror. The vehicle was a Ford Explorer, a police interceptor. Decades of military service and simply existing as a black man in America had given David an almost instinctual radar for this exact scenario. He checked his speedometer. He was doing 33 in a 35-mile-per-hour zone. His tags were up to date. His turn signals were functioning. He maintained his speed, keeping his hands perfectly positioned at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel. For a mile and a half, the cruiser shadowed him. It was a psychological tactic, a game of vehicular intimidation meant to make the driver sweat, to provoke a sudden, nervous lane change or an acceleration that would justify a stop. David didn't take the bait. He drove with the steady, unbothered precision of a man who had navigated convoys through IED-laden roads in Fallujah. Then the inevitable happened. The darkness of the cabin was violently shattered by the strobe of red and blue lights. The siren chirped a sharp, aggressive burst of sound that cut through the drumming rain. David sighed, the sound barely audible over the soft jazz playing on his stereo. He signaled his intention, pulled the heavy Lexus over to the shoulder smoothly, and placed the vehicle in park. He turned off the engine, turned on the interior dome light, and rolled down both the driver's side and rear passenger windows. He placed his keys on the dashboard, in plain sight, and rested both hands flat on top of the steering wheel. Textbook compliance. In his side mirror, he watched the driver's door of the cruiser swing open. Officer Travis Mitchell stepped out. Mitchell was 26, barely 3 years on the force, with a high and tight haircut he probably thought looked military, and a swagger that overcompensated for his profound lack of life experience. His partner, Officer Greg Miller, an older, heavier man who looked like he was just counting the days until his pension, stepped out of the passenger side and hung back by the rear bumper, shining a high-powered maglite directly into David's side mirror to blind him. Mitchell approached the driver's window, resting his right hand heavily on the butt of his holstered Sauer. It was an escalation tactic from the first second. "Do you know why I pulled you over?" Mitchell demanded. There was no good evening, no sir. Just a sharp accusatory bark. David looked at the young officer, keeping his voice calm, modulated, and entirely devoid of emotion. No, officer, I do not. Your license plate light is out, Mitchell lied smoothly. It was the oldest excuse in the book, the universal catch-all for a fishing expedition. And you drifted over the double yellow line back on Elm Street. I see, David said neutrally. He knew both statements were mathematically impossible given the Lexus's lane assist technology and the fact that the car had rolled off the dealership lot 3 days ago. I wasn't aware. License, registration, and proof of insurance. Now, my license and military ID are in my wallet, which is in my back right pocket. My registration and insurance are in the glove compartment, David stated clearly, narrating his movements. I am going to reach for my wallet first. Is that acceptable? Mitchell's eyes narrowed, clearly annoyed by the polished, articulate cadence of the man sitting in the luxury car. Just get the ID, and no sudden movements. David slowly leaned forward, sliding his right hand to his back pocket, retrieving the leather bifold. He opened it, extracted his driver's license, and offered it through the window. He did not pull out his military ID. He had always believed his service shouldn't be used as a get-out-of-jail-free card for traffic stops. Mitchell snatched the card, shining his flashlight directly into David's eyes, then down at the license. David Henderson, he read, his tone dripping with skepticism. He looked at the pristine leather interior of the Lexus, the premium dashboard, the cashmere sweater. This your car, David? It is. What do you do for a living that affords a $100,000 car, David? Mitchell asked, the disrespect palpable in the repeated, unauthorized use of his first name. I work for the government, David replied calmly. The government? Mitchell scoffed, glancing back at Miller. Like the DMV? Postal Service. I work at the Pentagon. Mitchell leaned in closer, rain dripping from the brim of his hat onto the door panel of the Lexus. Step out of the vehicle. David did not immediately move. He kept his hands perfectly still on the steering wheel. Officer, I have provided my identification. If you are issuing a citation for the license plate light, I will accept it. But what is your probable cause for ordering me out of my vehicle? Under the Supreme Court ruling of Pennsylvania v. Mims, a police officer can order a driver out of a vehicle during a lawful traffic stop. David knew the law. He also knew that asserting his rights often triggered fragile cops. Mitchell's face flushed a deep, angry crimson. The hand on his sidearm gripped the weapon tighter. Because I gave you a lawful order. That's my probable cause. Step out of the car right now, or I will drag you out. At the rear of the car, Officer Miller finally moved up, unclipping his taser. Hey man, just do what he says. Don't make this hard, Miller grunted, his voice tight with sudden adrenaline. David knew the statistics. He knew how quickly a dark road, rain, and panicked, aggressive officers could turn a traffic stop into a tragedy. He was a colonel in the United States Army, but right now, to Officer Travis Mitchell, he was just a threat that needed to be neutralized. I am stepping out of the vehicle, David said loudly and clearly. I am unbuckling my seatbelt. He moved with exaggerated slowness, popped the door handle, and pushed the heavy door open. He stepped out into the freezing rain. At 6'2" and broad-shouldered, David towered over Mitchell by a good 4 inches. The physical discrepancy only seemed to make Mitchell more furious. Turn around. Face the car. Hands on the roof, Mitchell barked, unholstering his handcuffs. David complied. He placed his hands flat on the wet roof of his car, spreading his feet as instructed. Mitchell grabbed David's left wrist, yanking it violently behind his back. It was completely unnecessary force designed to inflict pain and assert dominance. David's shoulder flared with agony, an old rotator cuff injury from his time at Bagram Air Base, screaming in protest. But he didn't make a sound. He let his arm be maneuvered, his face a mask of stoic iron. Click, click, click. The cold steel locked around his wrists. What am I being detained for? David asked, his voice still terrifyingly calm. Suspicion of driving under the influence and resisting a lawful order, Mitchell sneered, patting David down with a roughness that bordered on assault. He dug into David's pockets, pulling out the wallet again, his cell phone and a money clip. Mitchell flipped open the wallet, digging through the cards. His flashlight beam caught the distinct green and white of a Department of Defense Common Access Card, CAC. He paused, pulling it out. "What's this?" Mitchell asked. "My military identification," David replied. Mitchell studied the card. It clearly bore David's photo, his rank of 06 Colonel, and the Department of the Army seal. Instead of backing down, Mitchell's ego dug a trench and prepared for a last stand. "Where'd you buy this, David?" Mitchell laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Online? You think flashing a fake military ID is going to get you out of a DUI? It is a federal offense to impersonate an officer of the United States Armed Forces," David said, his voice dropping an octave, carrying the undeniable timbre of command. "I suggest you run the ID through your terminal before you make an accusation of stolen valor." "Shut up," Mitchell snapped, shoving the ID back into the wallet and tossing it onto the passenger seat of the Lexus. "Miller, call for a towel. We're impounding the vehicle." "We're taking him in." Miller looked hesitant. He had been a cop for 20 years. He looked at the perfectly sober man, the pristine car, the real-looking military ID, and the complete lack of any actual evidence. "Travis, maybe we just write him the fix-it ticket and let him go. He's not impaired." "He resisted," Mitchell shot back, eyes wild with the high of his own perceived authority. "He refused a lawful order. He's going to the station. Put him in the back of my cruiser." Labs. And wow, why? David was practically shoved into the cramped plastic-lined back seat of the Ford Explorer. The rain hammered against the roof. He sat there, hands cuffed uncomfortably behind his back, rain dripping from his chin onto his cashmere sweater. He watched as his beautiful new car was hooked up to a rusted tow truck, the metal chains scraping against the custom undercarriage. He felt a deep, simmering anger, a cold fire burning in his chest. He had bled for this country. He had sent young men and women to die for the freedoms supposed to be enjoyed on this very soil. And here he was, chained like an animal because a 26-year-old with a badge felt inadequate. "You have no idea what you've just done," David thought, staring at the back of Mitchell's head as the cruiser slammed into gear. "But you will." The Covington Point Police Department was a brick-and-glass building that looked more like a modern library than a precinct. It was well funded by the exorbitant property taxes of the wealthy residents it served. Inside, the fluorescent lights buzzed with a sterile, unforgiving hum. David was marched through the double doors, his wet shoes squeaking against the polished linoleum. The precinct was relatively quiet, with a few officers doing paperwork at their desks and a tired-looking sergeant sitting behind the elevated booking counter. "What do we have, Mitchell?" asked Sergeant Davies, barely looking up from his computer screen. "Failure to comply, resisting, possible DUI, and possession of forged federal documents," Mitchell announced loudly, ensuring the other officers in the room heard him. He shoved David toward the counter. "Thinks he's some big-shot military officer. Got a fake ID and everything." Sergeant Davies frowned, finally looking at David. He took in the man's posture. Even in wet, ruined clothes, handcuffed and standing in a police station, David carried himself with an aura of absolute, terrifying authority. Davies, who had done 4 years in the Marines before joining the force, recognized the bearing immediately. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up. "Take the cuffs off him," Davies ordered softly. "Sarge, he was belligerent." "I said take the cuffs off him, Mitchell," Davies repeated, his voice hardening. Mitchell grumbled, unlocking the cuffs. David brought his arms forward, rubbing his wrists slowly, deliberately. He looked directly at Sergeant Davies. "I am permitted a phone call, Sergeant?" David asked. "You are," Davies nodded, sliding a desk phone toward the edge of the counter. "You want to call a lawyer?" "No," David said, picking up the receiver. A lawyer won't be necessary for this. Mitchell scoffed, leaning against the counter. Who you gonna call, David? The fake general who gave you the fake ID? David ignored him. He dialed a number from memory. It wasn't the number for a defense attorney or a bail bondsman or even his wife. He dialed the direct cell phone number of Major General Richard Hayes, the commanding officer of the Eastern Logistics Command, a man who answered directly to the Joint Chiefs and who happened to be David's direct superior and mentor of 15 years. It rang twice. Hayes, a gruff, sleepy voice, answered. It was nearly midnight. "Sir, it's Colonel Henderson. I apologize for the late hour." There was a shift on the other end of the line, the sleep vanishing instantly. "David, what's wrong? Are you all right?" "I am physically unharmed, General. However, I have been unlawfully detained by officers of the Covington Point Police Department. My vehicle has been impounded without cause. I have been accused of driving under the influence, resisting arrest, and, amusingly, possessing a forged Department of Defense identification card." Silence hung on the line for 3 long seconds. When General Hayes spoke again, his voice was dangerously quiet. "Where are you exactly?" "Covington Point Police Precinct, sir. Officer Travis Mitchell and Officer Greg Miller were the arresting officers." "Stay exactly where you are, David. Do not say another word to them. I am making 3 phone calls. The first is to the governor. The second is to the state police superintendent. The third is going to be the worst wake-up call the chief of Covington Point has ever received in his miserable life. Give me 10 minutes. Understood, sir?" "Not David hung up the phone and pushed it back towards Sergeant Davies. Mitchell was smirking. "Nice performance. What's the plan? The cavalry coming to break you out?" "Something like that," David said, crossing his arms, standing at parade rest. 4 miles away, in a sprawling, comfortable suburban home, Chief of Police Robert Bob Callahan was deep asleep. He was a politician in a uniform, a man who spent more time at Rotary Club dinners and country club golf courses than doing actual police work. He liked his job because it was easy. The crime rate was virtually 0, the budget was massive, and his biggest headaches were usually noise complaints at high school graduation parties. His cell phone vibrating wildly on the nightstand startled him awake. He knocked over a glass of water, fumbling for it in the dark. He squinted at the caller ID. It was the personal cell of William Sterling, the mayor of Covington Point. Bob swiped to answer. "Bill? It's midnight. What's going on?" "Bob, shut up and listen to me." The mayor's voice was frantic, pitched high with panic. "I just got a call from the governor's chief of staff." "The actual governor, Bob? Do you have any idea what your idiot night shift boys just did?" Bob sat up straight, the blood draining from his face. "What? No. Mau? What happened?" "They just arrested a highly decorated army colonel who works out of the Pentagon. A black man, Bob, driving a brand new Lexus. They dragged him out of his car, cuffed him, accused him of having a fake military ID, and impounded his vehicle." So... Bob felt his stomach bottom out. "Oh, God." "The governor's office is fielding calls from a major general at Fort Belvoir who is threatening to rain absolute federal hellfire on this town. The state police superintendent is dispatching a captain to your precinct right now to take over the scene. Get out of bed, get your pants on, and get down to that precinct before we make national news by sunrise." The mud didn't wait for a response. The line went dead. Bob Callahan sat in the dark, clutching his phone, his chest heaving. He had 90 sworn officers under his command. He didn't know which one had pulled the trigger on this colossal disaster, but he knew one thing with absolute certainty. The quiet, comfortable life he had built in Covington Point had just ended. The drive to the precinct took Chief Robert Callahan 9 minutes. He broke every traffic law in his own municipality to get there, his unmarked SUV hydroplaning twice on the rain-slicked asphalt of Route 1. His mind was a frantic, terrifying loop of worst-case scenarios. A federal lawsuit, a Department of Justice civil rights investigation, his own forced early retirement. When he slammed his vehicle into the reserved spot out front, he noticed the ominous silhouette of a sleek black Dodge Charger parked illegally near the entrance. State Police, Mayor Hastings hadn't been exaggerating. Callahan pushed through the glass double doors of the Covington Point precinct, his tie crooked, his raincoat hastily thrown over a rumpled dress shirt. The atmosphere inside was no longer the sterile, quiet hum of a midnight shift. It felt like the air before a localized earthquake. At the booking counter, Sergeant Davies was standing rigidly, his face completely drained of color. Sitting on a hard plastic bench in the waiting area, entirely unbothered, was Colonel David Henderson. He was still in his damp cashmere sweater, his posture perfect, his expression an unreadable mask of absolute discipline. Across the room, near the break room door, Officer Travis Mitchell was holding a styrofoam cup of coffee, completely oblivious to the radioactive decay of his own career. He was currently regaling two other patrolmen with an exaggerated version of the traffic stop. "Chief," Sergeant Davies choked out, stepping around the counter. Before Callahan could even speak, the heavy steel door leading to the administrative offices swung open. State Police Captain John Reynolds stepped out, followed by two uniformed state troopers. Reynolds was a notoriously uncompromising man known for dismantling corrupt local precincts with surgical precisions. "Chief Callahan," Reynolds said, his voice echoing in the sudden silence of the room. The patrolman by the break room stopped laughing. Mitchell froze, his coffee cup halted halfway to his mouth. "You're late to your own disaster." "Captain Reynolds," Callahan stammered, his eyes darting between the state police, his own sergeant, and the black man sitting on the bench. "I just got the call. I need to be briefed on what exactly happened here." Reynolds didn't look at the chief. He walked directly over to David, extending his hand. "Colonel Henderson, Captain Reynolds, Virginia State Police. On behalf of the Commonwealth, I apologize for the profound indignity you've experienced tonight. The governor's office sends their personal regards." David stood, shaking the captain's hand with a firm, measured grip. "I appreciate the swift response, Captain. However, apologies are premature. I am currently the victim of an unlawful detention, an illegal search and seizure, and the theft of my vehicle under the guise of an impoundment." Mitchell, suddenly realizing the gravity of the men who had just walked into his station, felt a cold sweat break out on the back of his neck. He stepped forward, his ego instinctively trying to override his panic. "Hold on a second." This man refused a lawful order. He was combative. "I had probable cause." "Shut your mouth, officer," Reynolds snapped, the command slicing through the room like a physical blow. He turned to one of his troopers. "Secure Officer Mitchell's duty weapon, his badge, and his body-worn camera. Do the same for his partner." "You can't do that," Mitchell protested, his voice cracking as a state trooper advanced on him. "Chief, tell him. I made a lawful collar." Callahan looked at Mitchell, his eyes wide with a mixture of rage and terror. "Do whatever the captain says, Travis." Now, within seconds, Mitchell and Miller were disarmed, their gun belts and badges resting on Sergeant Davies' desk. The state troopers extracted the memory cards from their body cameras. "Sergeant," Reynolds ordered, "pull the dashcam footage from Cruiser 42. Put it on the main monitor in the briefing room. Now, I want everyone in this room to see exactly what probable cause looks like in Covington Point." The briefing room was suffocatingly tense. Chief Callahan, Captain Reynolds, Colonel Henderson, Sergeant Davies, and the two disarmed officers stood in the dark as the projector hummed to life. The screen flickered, showing the rain-swept footage from Mitchell's cruiser. It showed the midnight blue Lexus driving flawlessly. It showed the speedometer data from the cruiser, 33 miles per hour. It showed no lane drifting. The license plate lights on the Lexus were glaringly, undeniably functional, illuminating the temporary dealer tags perfectly. Then came the audio from the body cams. The room listened in agonizing silence as Mitchell's aggressive, sneering voice filled the space. They heard David's calm, compliant responses. They watched as Mitchell demanded David step out of the car without a shred of legal justification, violently yanked the colonel's arm behind his back, and mocked his military identification. "Where'd you buy this, David? Online? You think flashing a fake military ID is going to get you out of a DUI?" The video ended, freezing on the image of David being shoved into the back of the cruiser. The silence in the briefing room was absolute, heavy enough to crush bone. Chief Callahan buried his face in his hands, letting out a long, ragged groan. His career was over. Mayor Hastings was going to demand his resignation by dawn. Captain Reynolds slowly turned to look at Mitchell. The young officer was trembling, his face a sickly shade of gray. "A broken license plate light, Officer Mitchell?" Reynolds asked softly. "Is that what you wrote on your preliminary report?" It must have flickered," Mitchell stammered, the lie crumbling to dust as it left his mouth. "From my angle, it looked out." "You falsified a reason for a traffic stop," Reynolds stated, his voice devoid of any sympathy. "You unlawfully ordered a civilian from his vehicle. You escalated to physical force without provocation. You ignored valid federal identification, mocked a senior military officer, and then arrested him without a single element of a crime being present." "He was acting suspicious," Mitchell yelled, desperation making him reckless. "A guy like that, driving a $100,000 car in Oak Creek at midnight? He didn't belong there. I was doing my job. I was protecting the neighborhood." The room dropped 10 degrees. Mitchell had just said the quiet part out loud. He had just confessed to racial profiling in front of a state police captain, his chief of police, and a Pentagon official. David Henderson stepped forward. He didn't yell. He didn't need to. His presence consumed all the oxygen in the room. "I purchased my home in Oak Creek 6 months ago, Officer Mitchell," David said, his voice dangerously calm. "I have served this nation for 30 years. I have bled in 2 separate combat theaters to ensure the Constitution of the United States is upheld. Yet you looked at me, decided I did not fit your aesthetic criteria for the neighborhood, and suspended my constitutional rights on a whim." I didn't know," Mitchell whispered, shrinking back against the wall. "Ignorance of my identity does not excuse the violation of my rights," David replied sharply. "Had I been a teenager driving home from a late shift, had I been anyone without the ability to summon the state police, your fabricated charges would have ruined my life. You are a predator wearing a badge." At that moment, the door to the briefing room opened again. A man in a pristine, perfectly tailored Army service uniform walked in. He carried a sleek leather briefcase and bore the rank of captain. "Colonel Henderson," the man said, snapping a crisp salute. "Captain Wright," David returned the salute. Wright was a JAG officer, a military lawyer, dispatched directly by General Hayes. He turned his attention to Chief Callahan, his eyes cold and analytical. "Chief Callahan, I am Captain Thomas Wright, Judge Advocate General's Corps. I have been instructed by the Office of the Secretary of Defense to monitor this situation. First and foremost, where is the Colonel's vehicle?" Callahan swallowed hard. It's at the municipal impound lot, Captain. Have it returned to the front doors of this precinct immediately. Not towed, driven carefully by a bonded professional," Wright ordered. "Furthermore, I require the immediate expungement of any booking records, photographs, or fingerprints taken from Colonel Henderson tonight. If a single byte of data regarding this unlawful arrest enters the NCIC database, the federal injunctions against your municipality will bankrupt it." "It hasn't been entered," Sergeant Davies spoke up quickly, desperate to mitigate the damage. "He wasn't processed. I held off on the booking." "A rare display of competence tonight," Wright noted dryly. Officer Greg Miller, who had been standing silently in the corner, suddenly cracked. He was 50 years old, 3 years away from a comfortable pension, and he was watching his entire life evaporate because of his arrogant rookie partner. I told him not to do it, Miller blurted out, his voice shaking. Mitchell whipped his head around. Greg, shut up. No, I won't shut up, Miller shouted back, pointing a trembling finger at Mitchell. Chief, he targeted the car the second we saw it turn onto Elm Street. He said, look at this guy. Bet he's running drugs. I told him we had no cause. I told him to let it go. When he asked for the ID, I told him the guy wasn't impaired. Travis just wanted to make an arrest. He wanted to flex. You rat! Mitchell lunged forward, but a state trooper effortlessly grabbed him by the collar and slammed him back against the wall, pinning him there. Enough, Captain Reynolds roared. He looked at Miller. Officer Miller, your willingness to speak up now is noted, but your failure to intervene when your partner was actively violating a citizen's civil rights makes you an accessory. You will both be facing an internal affairs investigation, and I am recommending this case to the Commonwealth's attorney for criminal prosecution. But Reynolds wasn't finished. He turned his severe gaze to Chief Callahan. And Bob, this isn't isolated, is it? Callahan flinched. John, I don't know what you mean. Don't lie to me, Reynolds interrupted. On my way here, I had my analyst pull the use of force and civilian complaint files for Officer Mitchell. You have a town of 8,000 people, Bob. In 3 years, Mitchell has racked up 14 complaints for aggressive behavior, unlawful searches, and racial profiling. All of them systematically dismissed by your office. The blood completely left Callahan's face. The twist of the knife had finally arrived. The state police weren't just here for one bad stop. They had found the rot in the floorboards. You swept his behavior under the rug because his father is the town council president, Reynolds stated, exposing the ugly truth that had kept Mitchell in uniform. You enabled a volatile, dangerous officer to protect your own political standing. The Department of Justice is going to tear this precinct down to the studs, Bob. And I will personally help them do it. Mitchell, pinned against the wall, finally began to cry. It wasn't remorse. It was the crushing, suffocating realization that consequence, true, inescapable consequence, had finally caught up with him. He had picked a fight with a giant, and the giant was currently stepping on his neck. David adjusted his cuffs, his expression devoid of pity. Captain Reynolds, I will be filing a formal federal lawsuit against the Covington Point Police Department, Officer Mitchell, Officer Miller, and Chief Callahan on Monday morning. I do not want a monetary settlement. I want their badges permanently revoked, and I want a federal monitor placed over this precinct. You will have our full cooperation, Colonel, Reynolds promised. 30 minutes later, the midnight blue Lexus LS500 was parked in front of the precinct. It had been meticulously wiped down by a terrified impound lot attendant. David Henderson walked out of the double doors, flanked by Captain Wright and Captain Reynolds. He didn't look back at the glass building. He unlocked his car, the lights flashing a gentle, welcoming greeting in the dark. Inside the precinct, Chief Callahan sat in a folding chair, staring blankly at the wall, waiting for the phone call from the mayor that would end his career. Travis Mitchell was sitting in a holding cell, the very cell he had intended to throw David into, waiting for his union representative, stripped of his badge, his gun, and his power. The rain began to slow, the storm finally breaking as David started his engine, pulling away from the precinct, leaving the ruins of a corrupt administration in his rearview mirror. The weekend passed in a suffocating, agonizing silence for the leadership of Covington Point. For Chief Robert Callahan, those 48 hours felt like an extended funeral for his own life. He had spent his Saturday and Sunday frantically calling every political ally, every judge he played golf with, and every defense attorney in the Commonwealth of Virginia. None of them returned his calls. The political quarantine had already been established. The machinery of consequence, usually slow and grinding, had been put into hyperdrive by the Pentagon and Virginia State Police. By 8 a.m. on Monday, the Covington Point Municipal Building was under siege. The building, a colonial-style brick structure nestled among centuries-old oak trees, was completely surrounded. But it wasn't protesters or the media holding the line, it was an army of suits. Inside the closed-door chambers of the town council, the atmosphere was a toxic mixture of denial and sheer panic. Mayor Bill Hastings was pacing the length of the mahogany conference table, his usually immaculate hair disheveled, sweat pooling under his collar. Sitting at the head of the table was Richard Mitchell, the president of the town council, the wealthiest real estate developer in the county, and the father of Officer Travis Mitchell. Richard was a man used to buying his way out of inconveniences. He slammed his fist down on the table, rattling the crystal water pitchers. "This is an absolute overreaction," Richard bellowed, his face flushed with the same arrogant crimson his son had displayed on Route 1. It was a traffic stop, a misunderstanding. The guy had a fake-looking ID, and Travis made a judgment call. "We'll issue a formal apology, suspend Travis with pay for 2 weeks, and write the colonel a check from the discretionary fund. 50 grand should shut him up." Mayor Hastings stopped pacing and stared at Richard as if the man had just suggested setting the building on fire. "Richard, are you medically insane?" Hastings shrieked, his voice cracking. "Have you not read the briefing? Have you not seen the dashcam footage? He didn't pull over a local teenager. He pulled over Colonel David Henderson. The man is a senior logistics commander for the United States Army. He has friends at the Department of Justice. State Police Captain Reynolds was in our precinct on Friday night. The governor's office has already issued a statement condemning our police department. You can't buy your way out of a federal civil rights violation." Before Richard could fire back, the heavy double doors of the council chamber swung open. Chief Robert Callahan walked in, looking like a man walking to his own execution. He was not alone. Flanking him were 3 individuals who represented the absolute worst nightmares of any municipal government. The first was Captain John Reynolds of the State Police, his uniform perfectly pressed, his expression lethal. The second was a tall, sharp-featured woman in a tailored Navy suit, Assistant United States Attorney, AUSA, Sarah Jenkins, representing the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice. The third was a man in a pristine charcoal bespoke suit carrying a thick leather briefcase, Arthur L. Davies, a senior partner at one of Washington, D.C.'s most ruthless civil rights litigation firms. "Meeting is called to order," AUSA Jenkins said dryly, not waiting for an invitation to speak. She walked directly to the end of the table and dropped a massive 500-page bound document onto the polished wood. The thud echoed like a gunshot. "What is the meaning of this?" Richard Mitchell demanded, standing up. "This is a closed session of the Covington Point Town Council." "Not any more, Mr. Mitchell," Attorney Arthur Davies replied smoothly, taking a seat and unbuttoning his suit jacket. "As of 8 a.m. this morning, my client, Colonel David Henderson, has formally filed a lawsuit in the United States District Court for the Eastern District of Virginia. We are filing a Section 1983 claim against Officer Travis Mitchell and Officer Greg Miller for the deprivation of civil rights under the color of law. Furthermore, we are filing a Monell claim against the municipality of Covington Point, Chief Robert Callahan, and the town council." Richard scoffed, leaning forward. "A Monell claim? Good luck proving a pattern of unconstitutional behavior based on one bad traffic stop. You're fishing, Counselor. A Monell claim named after the Supreme Court case Monell v. Department of Social Services allows a plaintiff to sue a local government for constitutional violations if they can prove that the violation was the result of an official policy, custom, or a systemic failure to train and supervise officers. It was notoriously difficult to prove." Attorney Davies smiled. It was a terrifying, predatory smile. "Oh, we aren't fishing, Mr. Mitchell. We already have the fish in the boat." Davies gestured to Chief Callahan. The chief looked down at his shoes, his hands trembling. "Chief Callahan," Captain Reynolds said, his voice hard. "Explain to the council president what you provided to the state police and the FBI on Sunday afternoon." Hastings gasped. "The FBI? Bob, what did you do?" Callahan swallowed hard, finally looking up. His eyes met Richard Mitchell's, and in that moment the chief decided that if he was going down, he wasn't going down alone. "I gave them the emails, Richard," Callahan said, his voice barely a whisper. "I gave them the financial directives." The color instantly drained from Richard Mitchell's face. The bluster evaporated, replaced by a hollow, sickening dread. "What emails?" Mayor Hastings demanded, looking frantically between the chief and the council president. AUSA Jenkins opened a manila folder she had brought with her. "We are referring to the encrypted email chain between Council President Richard Mitchell and Chief Robert Callahan, spanning the last 36 months. In these emails, Mr. Mitchell explicitly directs the police department to increase revenue through aggressive traffic enforcement and civil asset forfeiture." She pulled out a highlighted sheet of paper. "I quote from an email dated 6 months ago sent from Mr. Dew. Mitchell to Chief Callahan. Bob, the budget for the new municipal golf course extension is short. I need your boys out on Route 1. Target the outer state plates. Target the luxury vehicles passing through from D.C. Find a reason to stop them, search them, and impound the cars if you find so much as a stray pill. We need the forfeiture auction revenue. And let's keep Oak Creek pristine. If they don't look like they belong in this zip code, get them out of it." The room went dead silent. The humming of the HVAC system suddenly sounded like a jet engine. "That is a clear, documented mandate for racial and socioeconomic profiling," Jenkins continued, her voice cold and absolute. "You ordered your police force to act as armed tax collectors and neighborhood bouncers. You weaponized the badge to fund your pet projects and enforce an unconstitutional barrier around your town." "None but Tobers. Nah. Handle, you son of a bitch," Hastings whispered, staring at Richard in pure horror. "You used the police department to run an extortion racket." To make matters worse, Captain Reynolds stepped in. "We have uncovered the internal affairs files. 14 civilian complaints against Officer Travis Mitchell in 3 years. All of them for aggressive behavior, unlawful detention, and racial profiling. Chief Callahan personally buried every single one of them under the direct threat of termination by Council President Mitchell." Davies leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. "My client, Colonel Henderson, is not seeking a financial settlement for himself. He is requesting exactly $1 in compensatory damages. He does not want your taxpayers' money. Not, nairi, sweet." Richard looked up, a glimmer of confused hope in his eyes. $1? Then what does he want? "He wants the eradication of this rot," Davies stated. "Our lawsuit seeks an immediate federal injunction. We are demanding the termination and decertification of Chief Callahan, Officer Mitchell, and Officer Mitchell. We are demanding that the Covington Point Police Department be placed under a federal consent decree, overseen by a DOJ-appointed monitor. And finally, we are submitting all of this evidence to the United States Attorney for the criminal indictment of everyone involved in this conspiracy, including you, Mr. Mitchell." Mitchell collapsed back into his leather chair, the wind completely knocked out of him. The invincible empire he had built in this wealthy suburb had just been dismantled in less than 10 minutes. "You have 24 hours to agree to the consent decree and determinations," AUSA Jenkins added, packing up her folder. "If you fight this, we will freeze every municipal asset Covington Point possesses. We will rip this town down to the studs." As the federal and state officials turned to leave, Captain Reynolds paused at the door, looking back at Chief Callahan. "Turn in your badge and your service weapon to the desk sergeant on your way out, Bob," Reynolds said. "You're done." The wheels of federal justice, once fully in motion, crush everything in their path. The fallout from the Friday night traffic stop did not fade into the background of the 24-hour news cycle. It exploded into a national case study on municipal corruption and police abuse. 6 months later, the United States District Court for the Eastern District of Virginia, Alexandria Division, was packed to capacity. The courtroom, with its heavy oak paneling and somber lighting, felt like a cathedral of consequence. Judge Leonie Brinkema, a no-nonsense jurist known for her strict adherence to constitutional law and zero tolerance for government overreach, presided over the bench. Sitting at the defense table, looking vastly different from the arrogant apex predator who had patrolled Route 1, was Travis Mitchell. He was no longer wearing a badge or a tailored uniform. He was wearing an olive-green jail jumpsuit, his wrists shackled to a chain around his waist, the swaggering entry placed by a permanent hollow stare. He was facing federal charges under 18 U.A. Cess Code Section 242, deprivation of rights under color of law. His partner, Greg Miller, had taken a plea deal on day one. In exchange for immunity from federal prosecution, Miller had testified against both Travis and the corrupt administration. Miller had surrendered his law enforcement certification permanently and was forced into early retirement without his pension. It was a harsh reality, but infinitely better than a federal cell. Chief Robert Callahan had also pled guilty to federal conspiracy charges. He was currently awaiting sentencing, his 30-year career ending in disgrace, his name forever synonymous with municipal corruption. But today was about Travis Mitchell. During the trial, Mitchell's high-priced defense attorney, paid for by the rapidly dwindling fortune of his father, had tried every trick in the book. He tried to argue that Mitchell had genuinely feared for his safety. He tried to argue that the dark, rainy conditions made the license plate light appear broken. He tried to argue that David Henderson's stoic, unyielding demeanor was combative and intimidating. It had all fallen apart the moment the prosecution played the body cam footage on the massive screen in the courtroom. The jury had watched in high-definition video and crystal-clear audio as a young, inexperienced officer systematically manufactured a crime. They heard the sneering disrespect. They saw the violent, unnecessary physical force used against a compliant senior military officer. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. Will the defendant please rise? Judge Brinkema requested, her voice echoing through the silent courtroom. Travis Mitchell stood up, his attorney gripping his elbow to keep him steady. "Mr. Mitchell," Judge Brinkema began, peering down through her glasses. "Law enforcement officers are entrusted with an extraordinary amount of power. They are granted the authority to deprive citizens of their liberty, and in extreme cases their lives. With that power comes a sacred absolute duty to uphold the Constitution of the United States." She gestured to the prosecution table where Colonel David Henderson sat quietly in his Army service uniform, his chest heavy with ribbons denoting decades of honorable service and sacrifice. "You looked at a man who has dedicated his entire life to defending the freedoms of this nation, and you saw only a target," the judge continued, her tone laced with profound disgust. "You fabricated probable cause. You used physical violence for no other reason than to inflict pain and assert dominance. You mocked his service. You lied on your official reports. You did not just break the law, Mr. Mitchell. You fundamentally betrayed the badge you wore." Travis swallowed hard, tears welling in his eyes, but there was no sympathy in the room. Furthermore, the evidence presented in this court paints a disturbing picture of a man who operated with absolute impunity, shielded by nepotism and a corrupt municipal hierarchy that utilized its police force as an instrument of extortion and racial exclusion. Judge Brinkema stated, her gavel resting in her hand, "For the charge of deprivation of rights under color of law, I sentence you to 48 months in a federal penitentiary, followed by 3 years of supervised release. You are permanently barred from holding any position of public trust or law enforcement at the local, state, or federal level. Officers, remand him into custody." "Not Manleo Joe." A collective exhale rushed through the courtroom as the U.S. Marshal stepped forward, taking Mitchell by the arms and leading him toward the side door. He looked back once, searching the gallery for his father. Richard Mitchell was there, sitting in the back row, looking broken and aged, his political empire shattered, his own federal indictment looming on the horizon. As the courtroom slowly emptied, Assistant U.S. Attorney Jenkins walked over to David Henderson. She extended her hand. "Colonel," Jenkins said warmly, Justice was served today. David shook her hand, but his expression remained thoughtful, devoid of celebration. He looked at the empty defense table, and then up at the seal of the United States mounted high above the judge's bench. Justice was applied today, Miss Schwartz. Jenkins, David corrected gently. But it only worked because of who I am. It worked because I had a major general on speed dial. It worked because I had a JAG officer dispatched to my location, and because the state police didn't want the political fallout of crossing the Pentagon. Jenkins nodded slowly, understanding the profound weight of his words. What haunts me, David continued, picking up his uniform cap, is thinking about the 14 other people in Travis Mitchell's file. The ones who didn't have stars on their shoulders. The ones who didn't have a voice that could shake a precinct. What happened to them? They paid the fines. They took the plea deals. Their lives were derailed and their faith in this system was shattered. He turned to face the doors of the courtroom. We removed the rot in Covington Point, David said softly. But this wasn't just about punishing one bad officer or one corrupt chief. It was about proving that the system can bleed when it infects its own. We won today, but the war for true blind justice? That continues tomorrow. Colonel David Henderson placed his cap precisely on his head, squared his shoulders, and walked out of the courtroom. He walked past the reporters, past the flashing cameras, and stepped out into the bright, unyielding sunlight of the Virginia afternoon. He had survived the asphalt predators, dismantled a corrupt regime, and walked away with his dignity entirely intact. Karma had not merely visited Covington Point. It had moved in, audited the books, and burned the corruption to the ground. Power is a dangerous intoxicant, but it is incredibly fragile when confronted by absolute unyielding discipline and truth. The story of Colonel David Henderson is a stark reminder that true authority doesn't come from a badge, a gun, or the ability to intimidate others. It comes from integrity. The corrupt officials in Covington Point believed they were untouchable behind their wealth and nepotism, completely blind to the fact that their arrogance was laying the very foundation for their own destruction. When you build an empire on injustice, it only takes one right person at the wrong time to bring the entire house of cards crashing down. If this story of real-life karma, systemic justice, and standing up against the abuse of power resonated with you, please hit the like button, share this video with anyone who needs a reminder that the truth always comes to light, and subscribe to the channel for more incredible stories of justice served. Leave a comment below. What would you have done in the Colonel's shoes? Let's keep the conversation going.